So let me give you an example that, unless you're involved in electronics, you probably haven't given much thought to, and that's the radio. Up until recently, every radio built took its radiating characteristics and its receiving characteristics from physical limitations in the materials used in its hardware. Specifically, we used crystals that vibrated at certain rates to determine whether or not a radio could transmit at a certain frequency and could receive at certain frequencies. And those were fairly inherent limits to the radio. And what it importantly meant was that you couldn't whisper new instructions to a radio that was intended to do one thing and have it jump off and do something entirely different. Your cell phone was never going to become an air traffic control radio inadvertently by you telling it to do the wrong things, provided its characteristics were analog. But what we've established over the last several years and increasingly started to use in regular consumer applications are what are called software-defined radios that take their characteristics on the one hand from some limitations in their hardware. They have analog to digital and digital to analog converters that run at a certain rate, but whose overall characteristics are defined by software. Which program you're running on your radio determines whether or not it's a Wi-Fi access point, whether it's a baby monitor, whether it's an air traffic control system, whether it's a 3G phone or a GPRS handset, or any of the other radio applications in between, only limited by the certain speed characteristics of some of the hardware connected to it. And that's a really important sea change, although it may not seem like it at the start, because what we used to do in the regulatory realm is the CRTC or the FCC, or in the UK where I live, Ofcom, would look at your radiating box. And they would go, well, we want to make sure that this doesn't make airplanes crash into each other in the sky. So we're going to ensure that there's nothing in this that is likely to turn it into something that blasts radio noise into air traffic control frequencies. We're going to make sure that this isn't something that inadvertently starts interfering with ambulance dispatch. And more pedestrianly, we're going to make sure that it doesn't inadvertently, clobber your neighbor's television signal or clobber your baby monitor or any of those other things. And that was possible when you were talking about what kind of hardware you were going to stick in the box, right? That was pretty inherently regulatable. It isn't to say that a bad guy couldn't build their own air traffic control radio jammer with off-the-shelf computer components. But what you could do is you could ensure that this device over here that you bought over at Canadian Tire didn't merely require a firmware refresh to turn it into something that might cause untold mischief. So what happened when software-defined radios came along is that we started to look for a way to regulate them too in the model that we had for physically defined radios, for analog radios. And so back when the first software-defined radios were being used in consumer applications, the American radio regulator, the FCC, put out a call for proposals on the question of whether or not we should be forcing people who build software-defined radios connected to general-purpose computers, whether they should fit those computers with some sort of governor that would prevent them from running programs that would cause the radio to make mischief. Right? And that was kind of a watershed moment in the history of radio, because it was the first time that radio started to enter the same regulatory realm that copyright had been in. Because for about 10 years before the radio regulators started talking about this, people who were involved in copyright had noticed that computers were very good at copying works, and they wanted to figure out how they could make computers worse at copying some works. And really, this has got a very old history, really the earliest days of consumer packaged software, back when you used to be able to go into a store and there would be shelves lined with software products. Ever since those days, people have been trying to figure out how to make software harder to copy in some contexts, right? Easy to copy onto the disks that you sell in stores, easy to copy maybe to your hard drive once, but hard to copy from your hard drive to someone else's hard drive. And they've met with pretty much total non-success, right? It must be said that this has ended up being largely a fool's errand, but it hasn't stopped anyone from trying. And it's that confluence of this fool's errand in software and the fool's errand in other kinds of copyrightable works, and the fool's errand in other realms that I really want to talk to you about today, about what happens when we start bringing the failed regulatory model that has really not gotten us anywhere in copyright and try to make it work in other realms too, and what consequences that has for the rest of us. So Today, for example, we have DVDs that theoretically don't allow you to copy them to your computer, or streaming video that theoretically you can watch on the internet but can't save off to your hard drive as it's coming to you. In fact, streaming is really interesting because in some technical sense, there's no such thing as a stream, right? A stream is just a download. In order for there to be a way to look at a video over the internet without a copy of it being made on your computer, the internet would literally have to be a series of tubes and mirrors, right? I mean, they would literally have to be just shining the light on your computer. The way that you show someone a video over the internet is by transmitting a copy of it to their computer, of all the zeros and ones. And what we say when we say, oh, I've sent you a stream and not a download, is I've sent you the file, and I expect that the software on the other end will throw it away when you're done watching it. That expectation has not been a very good one. And I'll give you an example of how that has failed. So in the United Kingdom where I live, we have a public broadcaster called the BBC, which is much like the CBC in that it takes a lot of public funding. It has a slightly different model in how it's funded. But by and large, it exists to serve the public. It takes money from the public. And they decided that it would be in the public interest if you could watch BBC shows over the internet, which sounds like it's in the public interest to me. But rather than just put up an archive of files or a slick iTunes-style way of browsing those files, they decided that they would come up with their own thing called the iPlayer. And the iPlayer incorporates a lot of really cool functionality as an iTunes-style console to look at what's on the BBC's website or on the BBC's file servers. But it also has a bunch of strange characteristics, like it supposedly doesn't let you save these files, or if they do save them, it saves them to an encrypted format that you're not supposed to be able to look at without permission. And that's because, for one reason or another, the BBC only wants you to be able to look at those files for 30 days. And they only want you to be able to download them for the first 7 days after the program airs, giving those files a maximum life on your computer of 37 days. They kind of want to preserve the ability to sell you a DVD and lots of other things. And we can talk later about whether or not those are legitimate goals. But one thing that is unequivocally true is that if the goal of the iPlayer is to stop people from making unencrypted copies of the programming the BBC airs and putting them on the internet for other people to look at without necessarily paying the license fee, is it's completely failed in that goal. Every program in the iPlayer ends up on the internet in file sharing networks in unencrypted formats that are easy to get hold of and just in interfaces that are as easy and convenient to use as the one that the BBC offers through the iPlayer. And they end up in lots of different ways, right? Either someone saves the stream, right, because they just run a streaming program that doesn't obey the delete this file when you're finished downloading it instruction. Or the BBC has this funny relationship with its programs because on the one hand, they make them available on the internet in this restricted format, but on the other hand, they're required by law to transmit them to every place in Britain. There are actually engineers who go around and make sure there's no place in Britain they don't transmit it to in an unencrypted format. So it's being blasted out over the air in a digital unencrypted format, and people just grab that one, right? It doesn't really matter to the producers of Doctor Who if the copy of Doctor Who that's circulating on the internet and maybe displacing sales of their DVD originated on the iPlayer or originated over the air. It's the program they care about, not which box it was extracted from before being popped on the internet. Or they wait till the DVD comes out and they rip it from that. So as with DVDs, even the most technically unsophisticated people can learn how to trivially defeat all the technology that sits between them and making unrestricted copies of DVDs. Either they go to Google and they type in DVD name space BitTorrent and they find a copy to download, or they hear someone whisper the word Handbrake and think, Handbrake, maybe that's a program I can use to rip my DVDs, and they find out that it is, and that it's just sort of one click and away you go. And so at that point, all of the technology that's been brought to bear to solve this problem has completely failed to solve the problem. It isn't making copying any harder, and it isn't, importantly, it isn't changing the characteristics of what we can do with general-purpose computers. Right? Anyone who wants to do something naughty with a general-purpose computer can do it, even though there are a bunch of regulatory and quasi-regulatory mechanisms in place, both in the form of software and in the form of law. Because of course, downloading a movie from using Google and BitTorrent is unlawful, and in many places you can get fined, or even now some people have gone to jail over this sort of thing. And of course, making some of this software is illegal, and hosting the download service is illegal, and in some cases, the operating system vendors themselves are embodying some of this control stuff right in the operating system, and even now in some of the hardware. And nevertheless, with all of that regulation at the hardware and the software layer and the operating system layer and in the legal layer, we're still not successfully regulating computers. And that's going to be important later when we talk about some of the things we'd hope people wouldn't be able to do with computers, like making superbugs. And so general purpose networks are also facing this kind of fight. It's not just the general purpose computer. So ISPs are being told all over the world that they should act as copyright police and that they should block certain bad sites. In the UK, we've had this now passed as secondary legislation in our Digital Economy Act. There's a bill up before the American legislature right now called COICA that makes the same provision. Weirdly enough, the heads of the Authors Guild in DC just wrote an essay in support of this bill making it illegal for certain websites to be accessed in the US on the basis that Shakespeare wouldn't have been able to survive today because our copyright laws are too weak, ignoring, oddly enough, that Shakespeare wrote before copyright laws were invented, and that most of the works that he wrote would be illegal under today's copyright law because they borrowed from his contemporaries. But that's another speech.